I am going to be talking for the next half an hour or so on the myth of self-development or self-transcendence. And I noticed that Vajrashura last night said he wasn't sure which phrase or term I was going to use. I think some of you who know me may already have a good idea of which term I would probably lean more towards. But what I want to do, partly because of the conversation that was had in the group last night that I was in, I just wanted to go through the definitions of the words. So I wanted to start briefly with myth. Vajrashura did talk about it last night. He talked about myth being stories, the significance that we have in our lives. Another way of looking at myth is that it's a true explanation of the natural world and how it came to be. It accounts for the way things are. So it's that sense of us trying to make sense of our experience. And it's not just analytical. There is an element of story. There's an element of us creating something around what our experience, excuse me, of the truth of reality is. So, excuse me. The word myth, it can actually be a very good reminder, because we do associate myth with story. So it is a reminder not to take our spiritual life too seriously. We do need to take it seriously, of course, but some of us can become particularly grasping or serious, or there was a phrase that when I worked in the area of personal development, a phrase called navel gazing, where we sort of just come in on ourselves and become very serious about our development and our story. Whereas with the term myth, that expands it out a little bit. It gives us more of a sense of the story, of the imaginal, of the creative side of our experience as well. It's also worth remembering that this is only one myth. There are many, many different myths. And even though some of you may already have quite a strong idea of what myth motivates you or is influencing your life and your practice at the moment, that most likely will change over the course of your Dharma life, over the course of your life in general. So I would like to remind you not to grasp too tightly onto any of the ideas, any of what we explore this weekend. For some of you, you might have a completely different story or myth. So it will be worth just taking the opportunity to explore the three myths this weekend. When I was trying to tease out the myth of self-development, I found that I kept leaning into the other two myths, and the self-discovery and self-surrender. They just kept coming into any of the notes I was making. And that's highlighting something quite important, quite significant as well. And I was trying to think of a way of explaining what my understanding of this is. And what I remembered was my daughter used to like me plaiting her hair, something that I never felt I was particularly good at, but she would ask me to plait her hair. For those of you that know nothing about plaiting hair, you split the hair into 3 strands, and then you weave them over and back over each other. You need all 3 strands. At any one time, depending on where you are in the process, one of them is the dominant one in your hand as you weave. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. I'm actually going to take the headphones off. I'll trust I won't pick up the sounds from downstairs. So even though I'm teasing out the myth of self-discovery this morning, it's not in isolation. It's not necessarily independent of the other 2 myths that we will be exploring. So it's important just to bear that in mind as well. They all interconnect, they all overlap, and we need all of them. We need all of them in this life. I also like to stress the importance of not taking things too literally. Taking things very literally can actually put us into a dead end, a blind alley, where if we get too literal about anything that we're exploring, particularly in the Dharma, we can find that we're grasping onto things. We're trying to make something solid, unmoving, unchanging, and of course, we know that that's not the case. So just be aware if you're having that tendency to take anything that I or any of the others say literally, just to try and pull back and have a look at the mythical, the magical, the more storytelling side of how we approach things. In the paper that Subhuti talked about, Bhadrashura mentioned it last night, in it he talks about how each of the myths have a front and a back. And the front of the myth is the truth that we're trying to grasp. Again, remember that in Buddhism, what we're doing is that we're seeing, it's not literally the goal, but it's like a sense of Buddhahood, enlightenment, and we're moving toward that. So what we're doing with our practices is that we're trying to move into the gap and to shorten the gap between the two, between where I am right now and where Buddhism or enlightenment is. So that would be the front end of each myth. The back end of a myth would be the dead end. It will be where we've gone a little bit too far, a little bit too extreme with it. And what that can do is that it, but I'll tease it out a little bit more in a few minutes. But it can just lead us into one of those blind alleys. If we take things too literally, if we take things too exclusively. So again, I really want to stress that, you know, we are talking using the language of myth here. So please just remember to bring in that creative element as I'm speaking. I think no matter what we're doing, we're probably oscillating between front and back at any given time. So if you are looking at, for example, this morning, the myth of self-development, what will become apparent is that there'll be times when we feel like, yes, I have it. You know, I can see the truth. I can see how I'm trying to grasp it or move toward it. But at the same time, though, we may also notice that at times we do slip into the back end of, or the flip side of the myth. And the flip side of the myth, or the back end of the myth, I like to think of it as a coin. So the flip side of that coin would be if I think that I'm successful, if I'm managing to achieve the closing of that gap, I think I've made some achievement. Sometimes people may have particularly positive experiences in a meditation practice. I'm thinking of somebody who was in my study group at one stage, and she tells the story of how she had a particularly good, a strong meditation practice where she probably slipped into some of the bliss states. And she thought she was enlightened, and she was delighted with herself, and she was telling us all. So it took somebody at the center to gently tell her that was probably not the case, that there was still a bit of work to do. So what can happen also is that if we've moved into thinking that we've succeeded and we've achieved something here, we can move into conceit, you know, or that sense of arrogance that, well, I'm a step above, I'm getting somewhere. They don't know what they're talking about. So there's that side of it that if we're not careful. On the other side of that, on the flip side of that, if we think or we perceive that we've failed in our practice, if we've had a particularly uncomfortable or unpleasant sit, or we've been maybe somewhat unskillful in some of our actions, we haven't lived up to the precepts as we're trying to live by them, we may slip into despondency or despair because we think we're failed. And sometimes what we can do when we move into that is it's not just, oh, I've had a slip up here today, or that wasn't a particularly comfortable practice. meditation this morning, we can move into, oh, this doesn't work for me, I'm useless at this, and off we go. Off we go into that mental proliferation. And that can take us into very deep and dark places if we think we've failed. There's a phrase that I've come across in some of the work I do, and it's there's no such thing as failure, only feedback. And I like it as a phrase because it's highlighting what I'm trying to say here is that we may perceive that we've slipped up, we may perceive that we've got it wrong, or that we've even failed at something. That can be painful. But it doesn't mean that we're useless, that this is not the life for us, that we'll never be enlightened. It just means we've slipped up. And often it motivates us to move forward. It motivates us to have a look at what we're doing. It motivates us to maybe try a little harder. It motivates us in many different ways. There's a lovely story of Honen. He was from Japan, and he lived around the 11 and the 1200s. And he talked about, or the story is that he read the Pali Canon, I think it was 5 times, which is a lot of reading to do, but he still felt he hadn't penetrated the truth. And so in that process of reading the canon, he would have been in the area or in the myth of self-development. He was trying to close that gap by moving from where he is to where he wanted to be. But he began to realize it just wasn't working. It just wasn't working. He wasn't penetrating what he felt was the truth. And so what he did was he actually stopped the reading, and he started to chant a particular mantra. I'm not going to say too much more of that, because where I'm moving into with all of that is that there is an element of self-surrender in that. But again, it does indicate how they all overlap. What I want to draw out in the story is that when he was trying too hard, when he was pushing too hard and staying totally what I would say analytical, focused, cognitive, he was missing something in the process. And so what he had to do was step back. What he had to do was step back, become more receptive, and allow, things to settle. And you'll often hear us saying that after retreats or after study, let things percolate, let things settle, let things process. So that's very, very important. So I've given you a sort of broad overview of things. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What is self-development or self-transcendence? Well, development I often associate with growth and development. It could be the nurse coming out of me, human growth and development. So for me, development is associated with growth, associated with an unfolding, with an organic process. Transcendence for me, it's not quite a phrase or a term that works for me. So I've actually looked it up, and it comes from the Latin. Trans meaning beyond, and sender from to climb. So transcendence is to climb beyond. So what we're doing, if we're calling this the myth of self-transcendence, is that we're moving beyond, or we're climbing beyond. So there's an element of activity there, climbing beyond our limitations. We're moving toward or upward. If it's transcendence, we're moving upward towards, in this case, Buddhahood, enlightenment. We've gone beyond our ordinary limitations. But as I said, I prefer the term development, because for me, the myth of self-development has that sense of organic growth, has that sense of setting up the conditions and allowing something to unfold. So for example, I like to garden. I don't do very much heavy gardening these days, but I still like to garden. So before you can actually plant the seed, you need to prepare the soil. You need to put effort in. And that's what we're doing with the myth of self-development. there's effort. It's willed effort. We've made the decision to do it. We've made the decision to move forward. Sangharakshita talks about the path of regular steps. So not only have we made the decision to move forward, but a point comes in our spiritual life, in our Dharma life, where we decide to do it in a more regular way. What does that look like in our day-to-day life? Well, some of us may start with a haphazard meditation practice. We'll do it for a few weeks, we'll stop. We'll do it for a bit more because we know it works, then we'll stop. For some of us, that might be coming to the center when we were able to, coming online. We'll do it and there'll be lots of energy, enthusiasm, and then we stop. But a point comes where we begin to recognize that actually we need to do this. We need to do this on a regular, consistent basis. So we need to put the effort in. And so we start on what we call the path of regular steps. So we're consistently, day in, day out, moving steadily towards what we see as the goal. I hate the term goal because for me, Buddhahood, enlightenment is not a fixed end. It's just that it's like the horizon. We don't really know what's beyond it, but it's what we can imagine. We see the horizon, but we've absolutely no idea what's beyond it, except in our imaginations. But if we want to get to the horizon, we have to put effort in. We have to put work in. What that work looks like in our day-to-day practice is you all started coming to the center. And the first things that you learned were the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana practices. And what they are is there's something to do. They're a set of practices, a set of tools to enable you to close that gap, to start moving toward Buddhahood, toward enlightenment. Yeah. Does that make sense? This is where yeah, okay, great, thank you. I usually ask that when I'm in the room with you all. Owen, are you okay? I'll give you an opportunity to ask a question at the end. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay, thanks. Another interesting thing about the myths is that we'll possibly find that we're actually temperamentally drawn to one of them. Some people I know in the group I was with last night definitely felt that they were temperamentally drawn to self-development. You haven't explored the other two just yet, so you may not know which one you're drawn to. But it can be interesting to recognize or to notice which one you're being drawn to at any particular time. Within Triratna, a lot of what we do in our centers, with the practices that we teach, particularly in the beginning, in the early stages of becoming a mitra, but all the way through spiritual life for us, in our Dharma practice, as people attending the center, as mitras, as order members. That myth of self-development, that willed effort does weave its way through. Even when we start to maybe have more focus on the other two areas, we still need the area of self-development at times. And again, like this is where we need mindfulness. We need to be aware of where we're at. Are we leaning too far into maybe going down to that flip side, that blind alley? Or are we using or in the area of self-development when actually what we need to do is sit back and allow things to unfold so that we're moving into some of the other myths. I don't want to say too much about them because you'll hear plenty over the weekend. So we need to be mindful, we need to be aware at any time in our practice. Other areas that you will be using the myth of self-development is in the area of ethics, when we're living by the precepts. The precepts, again, these are guidelines, these are training principles. Think about the language we use. These are tools that we're using to enable us to move forward or upward in our, depending on which development or transcendence you like. They're enabling us to move toward our perceived goal, Buddhahood, enlightenment. Another interesting point that is drawn out actually in the talks by Jnanavata and Maitreya Bandhu, they're on YouTube at the moment. They're called the Three Myths, and something that they draw out about the myth of self-development is that it also gives us a hierarchy. Now I know the word hierarchy for me sort of makes me a little bit nervous. Because I have ideas of about what it means. But what they're actually saying when they use that term is that if we have a hierarchy, it means that we're making progress, we're moving upward, we're developing. So we're becoming more evolved, more developed, more advanced. So we're moving from perhaps coming to the center first to becoming a mitra, to becoming an order member, and perhaps even to becoming a stream entrant or even enlightened. Who knows? But there's progression, and there is a hierarchy in that. But the thing about that is that when we think of it as a hierarchy, we actually can see where we've come from, what we've achieved, and then where we're going. So that's where I like the term hierarchy. The other thing about it is, and this is the element of Sangha, is that not only can we see where we are progressing, but we can also see where others are maybe a little bit further on the path. Maybe they seem to be a little bit more practiced in a particular meditation. They seem to have, sometimes you meet people when they've been practicing for a while, and you get a sense from them. You get a sense of, the only way I can describe it is like they're more comfortable in their skin. They've settled into their skin. So something's evolving, something's happening in their practice. You may notice that they're becoming more careful or more skillful in their speech, for example, so that they've perhaps moved on a little bit more than you. So that's how we're talking about hierarchy. We've got people to look up to. We've got people to learn from, to take example from, and that's really all it means. Yeah, I touched on how the other two myths weave in. So basically what we need is when we're working in the area of self-development in our Dharma practice, we may sometimes need that corrective side of self-surrender. So what can happen is that if we're putting too much effort in, too much push in, what we need to do actually is sometimes just pull back, let things unfold, let things evolve. We also need the balance of self-discovery, because if we're just getting focused in, I have to live by the precepts, I have to study all of the Pali Canon, what can happen is that we lose sight of ourselves. We lose sight of our practice unfolding, our sense of being unfolding, and that movement towards enlightenment. Also remembering that if we get too focused on ourselves, we've moved back into that blind alley where we've got into me and my enlightenment. So we constantly, I'm coming back to that being mindful, being aware. It's interesting that one of the ways that they quote the last words of the Buddha is, with mindfulness, strive on. So for me, what that is saying is that we need to be fully present, we need to be fully aware, but we do need to be working in this area of development, of evolving, of moving forward or upward, as I say, depending on how you see it. And that to me is what the myth of self-development is. I'm conscious of the clock. Actually, what I'll finish with is just about the essence of the myth of self-development. It's the idea that one must exert will in order to move oneself up the ladder or forward in spiritual evolution. So we're exerting will, we're putting effort into the practice. It also is saying that the spiritual life needs to be led by the individual. So we're not expecting somebody else to, magically give enlightenment to us. We need to make the effort. It needs to be coming from us as well. And it's also, the myth of self-development is actually asking us to renounce certain things, and to take on certain things. What that means in daily practice is that we're giving up certain things. So for example, we're giving up getting drunk when we're living by precepts. This weekend we're giving up extra input. So we're renouncing certain things because we want to move towards a more skillful or a deeper or more positive mental state. Cultivating others, what we're doing with the Metta Bhavana, we're cultivating loving kindness, we're cultivating qualities and a way of being in the world, a way of communicating. And we're doing that with loving kindness, with karuna, compassion, with dana, generosity. So we're cultivating. And all of these practices are part of the myth of self-development. So although the phrase, the term might seem to be a little bit, I won't say woolly, but for me, sometimes these phrases feel almost like a bit untouchable. I don't quite get them, but when I start to look at how they translate into my daily life, I begin to realize that actually they're very much involved in not just our spiritual practice, not just our Dharma life, but in our whole life. And we're constantly evolving, developing. So yeah, with the myth of self-development in the Dharma life, we're stepping onto the path of regular steps. We're cultivating the conditions that are conducive to us evolving, moving towards enlightenment, or at the very least, stream entry. I plan to have that one achieved, at least by the end of this lifetime. And also, we're practicing the system of meditation as we do within Triratna, particularly, as I say, the mindfulness of breathing, the Metta Bhavana. So I'm going to leave it there. I do have some questions, but what I'll probably do, it might make more sense, is to type them for when we're in the box, the chat rooms. So I'll type them into the chat box at that stage. That might be the easiest way of doing it. So I've got about...
Atulyamitra, there's a limit on how much you can put in the text, so it might, when in the chat box, it's quite awkward actually, so it might be better if you said them now actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That's okay, thanks.
Well, the questions are quite straightforward. So
maybe the group leaders can take these down as well.
Yeah. How do you relate to the myth of self-development? What does it mean to you? Ready? Can you see it influence or unfold in your practice or your life? I can hear some pencils or something still going. Okay.
Me, I think.
Oh, I'm showing my preference when I say pencils. It's a keyboard. Have you had experience of the back end of the myth? And if so, what it is? So it's just an area of discussion. And the last question would be, how do you think you could consciously bring the myth of self-development into your practice? Your practice being, your whole day, not just your meditation, practice of ethics, meditation, and wisdom.
Sorry, Atulyamitra.
Yes.
You're in here. Could you just, would you mind repeating the last question, please?
I don't have that one written down. So
no, the one you just said.
Yeah. Can someone else read it back at this stage?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
How do you think you could consciously bring self-development more into your Dharma life? How do you think you could bring self-development more consciously into your Dharma life? Or how do you think you could consciously bring self-development more into your Dharma life?
Okay, thank you. Owen, I know
Thank
you
you.
had a question there. Do you want to go ahead with it? I saw you waving at me. If anyone else was waving, I didn't see
Could
them.
I suggest, Atulyamitra, that we leave the questions for the breakout rooms, because that feels a more
Oh, okay. Yeah,
appropriate
yeah.
place to
Yeah,
do
no,
that
that's
kind of
fine.
thing.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, okay.
Okay. So I shall now hand back over to Vajrashura. So thank you, everyone. And
Great.
enjoy exploring the areas.
Great, thanks, Atulyamitra, for a great talk there on self-development. So you have those questions. So yeah, it was just really good to hear about all those, the strengths and the dangers dangers isn't the right word, back of self-development. The great thing about self-development is that it gives you something to do. You talked about how it is very easy to understand actually, and it gives you it really helps you. Emphasize all the positive conditions, the friendships, really make an effort in ethics, enables healthy hierarchy in the sense that you very well explained there, and watching out as well for the back ends of it, like despair and all that kind of stuff. So very good talk. So thank you very much. So let's be back here ready to go. Let's say at why don't we say. Or why don't we just say 5 to 12? Let's be back ready to go at 5 to 12. So maybe a couple of minutes before 5 to 12. So we'll take a break until then. But thank you again, Atulyamitra, for that. That was great.